Okay then, so we're just underway. Right, so we're in the book of Ruth. So we've done the Pentateuch. So we've done Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. All right, by looking at the whole of the Mosaic period, basically. So we've got creation through to the Mosaic time. And then last week we took a time to look at where we see Jesus in Joshua and Judges in the Promised Land. But within that period of time, in the time of the Judges, there's this little story that suddenly pops up in our Bible of Ruth. I've always loved it. I think it's a fabulous story. I actually used the vow that Ruth made to Naomi. I will go where you go. That vow is was my vow to Mike when we got married. So I always love reading the story of Ruth. And if you haven't read it, it's only 4 chapters, and it really is a story. So it's very easy to read, and especially if you pick it up in a paraphrase version of some sort, like The Message or something like that. It's a really easy read. And I've read it this week. And as Mike knows, I have had a problem this morning because I kept seeing other things. And so I've tried to sort of keep it contained this morning, but other little bits might pop off that aren't in your notes as we go through, okay? But the thing, and there's a lot of different things in Ruth. I mean, often we use the story of Ruth to show the importance of the relationship between Jew and Gentile, because Ruth was a Gentile who attached herself to Naomi, and that I will go where you will go, you know. But we're wanting to look at Jesus in Ruth this morning, and he is very clearly in Ruth in the whole idea of a kinsman redeemer. And that's what we're going to try and understand this morning, what it means for Jesus to be a kinsman redeemer. And by the end of this morning, we should be able to understand that. That's my intention. Because actually the idea of a kinsman redeemer is within the Bible quite a lot, and we need to understand it. And we often talk about him redeeming us, but to redeem us, there were certain things he needed to be, because everything that Jesus did aligned with the way that God has established his law and his way of working with his people. So in the same way as God has established the sacrifice of blood, so Jesus fulfilled that, God's purpose in establishing kinsman redeemers within his law, Jesus fulfills that as well. And the beauty of this story really is in this whole idea of kinsman redeemer. So where does that come from? Well, of course, I just said it's within the law, so we find it in Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 25. This is where Moses gives the law that the Lord has given him for the way in which a kinsman redeemer will operate. And it's to do with the land. It's to do with the land that we are in. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the country you possess, you shall allow a redemption of the land. If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. If a man has no one to redeem it, and then himself becomes prosperous and finds sufficient means to redeem it, let him calculate the years since he sold it and pay back the balance to the man to whom he sold it, and then return to his property. But if he has not sufficient means to recover it, then what he sold shall remain in the hand of the buyer until the year of Jubilee, and in the Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return to his property. Now that sounds like a very complicated little law that has absolutely nothing to do with us. But it's actually the foundation of redemption. It's actually what redemption means. When you don't have enough to hold on to it, when you don't have the means to hold on, when you have lost it because you have become unable or disqualified from owning it, then there is someone who should redeem it for you. When you have lost, there is someone who should give it back to you. And you think back to when those of us that were here Friday morning looking at Peter and starting to talk about redemption, which is why I was encouraging Mike not to go too far. It's because that is what's behind this. What we have lost can be redeemed. What we have lost because of someone else's fault or because of our own fault can be redeemed. And that's the story of Ruth. Well, the story of Naomi, which is called Ruth because it's because of Ruth's faithfulness that the redemption takes place. So, what if I turn this on, wouldn't it? So by definition, a kinsman redeemer was someone who redeemed what was lost. This could be someone else's property or their freedom or even their name. And the kinsman might also be called upon to exact revenge on someone who may have killed their relative. So go back into Leviticus and read more of it. If someone kills your relative, then your redeemer is someone who takes revenge for that killing. In other words, within a family, there was responsibility for one another. But in short, the kinsman was a rescuer and a restorer. And that takes us right back to what we were looking about in 1 Peter on when we were talking about the whole idea of a ransom being rescuing. Yeah. So a redeemer or the kinsman redeemer was one of your family, someone related to you, whose responsibility it was to rescue and restore. And it wasn't a passive obligation, and it wasn't something you could be entered into lightly. As we're going to see as we look at this, there were some obligations necessary for the person who would be that kinsman redeemer. So let's have a look first of all at how the kinsman redeemer is in the book of Ruth, and then we'll look how Jesus is also our kinsman redeemer, which are already the cogs are going, I know, and we're already thinking, oh, I haven't seen this. Once you know what it is, it's easier to see it. So the kinsman redeemer is revealed in the story of Ruth and Boaz. So just a quick overview. The book of Ruth tells the story. It's Naomi and Ruth. That's who the story is mainly about. Naomi is the mother-in-law who returns to Israel from Moab as a widow on the verge of losing the family inheritance. Naomi had actually left Bethlehem to go with her husband to Moab, and during a time of famine in Bethlehem. So this is during the time of the judges, all right? And so she leaves because of a famine, part of all that up and down in Judges that we were talking about last week, and they go to Moab. So this is what it says in the very first verses of the book of Ruth. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. Now we know from our things in sojourners are exiles, are people who go and live in another land. Yeah, so here's that word again. It's useful. Once we've begun to unpack it in a Bible study in one place, we begin to see it in others. So he went to sojourn as an exile into the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So this is a Jewish family from Bethlehem. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites, all right, some Ephrata, yes, Bethlehem and Ephrata from the birth of Jesus, from Bethlehem in Judah. They went, so Judah is the tribal, is the region that they were in. Ephrata is that sub-region, Bethlehem the town. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So just so we can know, if you can go on to the next slide, because it's just a little map. Okay, so just so you can see where they went. All right, so from Bethlehem, you go back over the Jordan, onto the other side and to the south, below the tribe of Reuben, into the tribe to where the Moabites lived. And Moab was a descendant of the union between Lot and his daughters-in-law. Remember the incestuous relationship? And one of the children that was born from that incestuous relationship was Moab. And so the Moabites are descended from that relationship with Lot. And so they They are a tribe, they're part of those who stood against the Israelites when they came into the land. But obviously there is food there. And so Elimelech chooses to take his family down there. But as we see, after 10 years, Naomi is left without a husband, without her sons, and she now has 2 daughters-in-law who are also widows. So we're looking at 3 widows. Now, it has to be said there were few things worse in those days than actually being a widow with no sons, because it meant that you had no income, no support, you had no men to care for you, which was the expected way of God for families to provide, that the men of the family would provide. And so being a widow, I mean, it's hard enough in this day and age, but you can get support for being a widow in these days, and there was no support unless you had family, and they have no family because they've left the family back in Bethlehem. Their only hope was that there was someone to see their plight and be willing to pay the price of redemption. In other words, to give them back what they needed. Somewhere to live, something to live on, someone to support them. Otherwise they'd lose everything. They wouldn't be able to hold the land. The land doesn't belong to the women, it belongs to the men. So Naomi decides that the only thing she can do is go back to Bethlehem, where she has got family. And if you read the whole story, you'll know that one daughter-in-law, they both say they'll go with her, and then one doesn't. And Ruth is the one who insists, even though Naomi says, "But there's no future for you. You won't be able to find someone to marry there. You're a Gentile girl. You stay here where you'll be able to find another husband and have another life. You don't need to come with me." But Ruth insists. And actually, the whole nature of Ruth is that she insists not only of travelling with her mother-in-law, but looking after her. And actually, when they get back to Bethlehem, Ruth ends up being held in very high esteem for the way that she's cared for her mother-in-law. Because when they arrive in Israel, Ruth actually goes and gleans in the fields. Now, just quickly, that means, this is where I'm saying, there's all the extra stuff. I'm going to get through this morning. But basically, when the fields were harvested, it's the barley. They arrive at the time of the barley harvest, and when the fields are being harvested, the grain that is left around the edges and where the harvesters haven't picked up everything, other people are allowed to come in. The poor are allowed to come in and just pick up what was left lying around, so that they would have something. And so Ruth ends up in the fields of this man called Boaz, gleaning. He sees her and actually befriends her. He feeds her, he invites her to come and have a meal with them. He invites her back. Ultimately, he gives her extra food to take back for her and Ruth. And so for Naomi. So when Ruth comes back, Naomi says, "Where'd you get all this from?" Because this is more than just gleaning. Where did you get all this from? And she tells her about this lovely, kind man who has helped her, called Boaz. And this is Naomi's response. In Ruth, that should be Ruth 2, not Ruth 20, sorry. Ruth chapter 2, there's only 4 chapters. Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." And Naomi also said to her, "This man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." This is the grace of God, that he takes Ruth into the field of one of the men who is one of their redeemers, related to them and could redeem them. One of our redeemers. In other words, one of our family who can take that responsibility. So, knowing that they need a redeemer, Ruth goes and approaches Boaz and finds out that he is, and in the whole thing, invites him to redeem her and the property. Now, it's a wonderful story. You need to read, because it's a beautiful story of how she does that. But Boaz is willing to be the redeemer, but he's not the closest redeemer. He's not the one first in line to redeem. So he has to clear that with a closer relative who actually decides he doesn't want to redeem, because he'd redeemed the land, but he's told that to redeem the land he will also have to marry Ruth. He'll need to redeem the family. The reason he needs to marry Ruth is to redeem the family line, so that the family can be continued. All right. So as the daughter-in-law of Naomi and Elimelech, she is the one who can now bring that family line back into agreement for a family line in the land. And so these widows who had lost hope actually suddenly find it again when Boaz becomes their redeemer. And Naomi's bitterness over all her hardships give way to joy as they give birth to a son, and she has a grandson. And many of us in this room will know the joy that then brings. She has a life again. The death of her husband and her sons is now redeemed through the birth of a grandson. And the whole family inheritance remains in the family, and God restores their whole lives. Now, the interesting thing is that Boaz wasn't that first in line to be a redeemer. There was this other relative. But he wasn't willing to, because this whole thing of taking on Ruth. But when Boaz does this, he establishes that next line. And so we read in Ruth 4, "Then Boaz said to the elders and to the crowd standing around, 'You are witnesses that today I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion and Mahlon.'" So he buys back all that land that belonged to them. "And with the land I have acquired Ruth." And I know we don't like that. I've acquired Ruth. But that's the truth. The Moabite widow of Mahlon. We know she's not unwilling because we've seen what she's done previously. So the Moabite widow of Mahlon to be my wife. This way she can have a son to carry on the family name of her dead husband and to inherit the family property here in his hometown. You are all witnesses today. So in being the Redeemer, they have received back their family name, their inheritance. They've had their family property restored as well. We can see some of what Jesus has done as a kinsman redeemer in that, but let's just first of all look at why Boaz was a kinsman redeemer. What did he need to, what were the requirements of him as a kinsman redeemer as laid down in the Levitical law? Well, the first thing was you had to be kin. The only way you could be a kinsman redeemer was that you had to be of the same family. There had to be some sort of relational tie. And we're not told what the relational tie is actually to Boaz, but he is part of their family. You had to be of like kind, okay? Secondly, you had to be willing. It couldn't be demanded of you. In Ruth and Boaz's story, the person who was the next redeemer in line wasn't willing, and it couldn't be forced upon him. But it had to be someone who was willing, and that was really at the heart of being a kinsman redeemer. You wanted to desire to do that. But you also had to be able. There's no good being willing if you didn't have the money to do it. You didn't have the wherewithal to do it. It wasn't just willingness. You had to have what was needed. And if you didn't have that financial means, you wouldn't be able to accomplish it. No matter how good your intentions, you had to have the wherewithal. And not only did you have to have it, you had to pay it. And you had to pay it in full. Remember, it says he bought all the land that belonged to the family. All right. So there was no such thing. You couldn't say, well, I'll buy that bit back for you. That will do. It had to be complete. It had to be the whole thing. Unless the price was paid in full, there wasn't any redemption. It was all or nothing. Well, how is Jesus our kinsman redeemer? Well, let's look at that and see what he did. Because what we will see, you see, what we have to understand is that Ruth and Naomi had no hope. They were desperate. They were destitute. They had no hope. They were lost. In the same way as we're lost in our sinful condition, we need someone who steps in and becomes our redeemer. And Jesus meets that kinsman redeemer requirement. Because the first thing he did was he came. He had to come and be one of us. He had to become like us. He had to take on humanity. That's why, I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why Jesus had to take on humanity. First and foremost, because the world was given to Adam as a man, and therefore Jesus had to take on that character. But here's another reason. He had to take on our humanity so he could be like us. Since sin came into the world through one man, it had to be taken by another man to bring our salvation and our righteousness. Because it was lost by a man, it had to be purchased back by a man. And so we would require the infinite God to take on human flesh. And that's what Jesus did. The Gospel of John tells us that. John 1:1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But then John 1:14 tells us the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. He became like you and me, which put him in the position so that he could redeem us. But we also know he was willing to do it. Philippians tells us that, and in many other places, but this is just one. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. It doesn't say he was made nothing. It says he made himself nothing. He chose it. By taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death. He chose to go to that cross. He wasn't made to, he chose to, even death on a cross. And John 10:18 says, this is what Jesus said, no one takes, that's his life, no one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, authority to take it up again. This command I receive from the Father. His death, which bought our redemption, was his choice. He chose to pay the price. But he was also able to do it. Having the willingness, as we said earlier, means nothing if he didn't have the ability to redeem it. No one else could have gone on that cross to redeem it. It had to be the Son of God. It had to be the pure and spotless Lamb. And thank goodness for us that he is the one who has what is needed. The death and obedience of Jesus was everything that was needed to bring about our redemption. He has paid it. Romans 5:18-19 tells us, consequently, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, so also one righteous act resulted in justification and life for all people. For just as through the disobedience of the one man the many were made sinners, so also through the obedience of the one man the many will be made righteous. You see, the sin of man gave up, meant we left behind everything that was ours, that could have been ours. Like Naomi and her husband left Bethlehem and went to the land of Moab. So we left, by sinning, we left what was right, what we could have had. And we transferred ourselves into a foreign land. But there is a way to come back into that which should have been ours. But we need a kinsman redeemer to buy it back for us. And that's why it talks about him paying the price on the cross. Have you ever wondered why it's called a price? Why did he pay a price? Well, because it's that price of redemption that had to be paid to give us back everything that we should have had.
Because Adam took it when he sinned.
Yeah, when Adam sinned, he left the garden. I mean, basically, what he's bought is the way back into the garden, is what he's bought, and we're going to look at that in a minute. But Adam had to leave. Adam had to leave. The sin meant he left the land that he was in, of Eden, and took all of us with him. Yeah. But now the redemption price that's paid in full by Jesus brings us back. It's very interesting. If you read the story, when the sign of showing that he was paying that price, all right, wasn't to give the money over. The sign was that he would take off his sandal. He took off his, that was how you showed that you were the Redeemer, that you were willing to be the Redeemer. You took off your sandal. You can read it in the story. And what does John say when Jesus comes? He says, I'm not worthy to take the sandal. Yeah. In other words, I'm not worthy to be the Redeemer. Only this one who's coming can do that. He's the one who will take off his sandal as your Redeemer. Nor had I. And I'm reading the story and going, hang on. I made the connection, which is not in the notes because I saw it after I wrote the notes, and it's probably a good job, really. So there you go. There's where the sandal thing comes in. All right, because what does that mean? Oh, it's a bit weird, isn't it? But Jesus is the one who took off his sandals, all right, and went to the cross and paid the price completely. We're told in Titus 2, he gave his life to free us from every kind of sin, to cleanse us and to make up his very own people, totally committed to doing good deeds. The beautiful thing about our redemption is that it is complete redemption. There's nothing else needed to complete or to bring it to pass, because he, as a kinsman redeemer, has paid everything that is needed. We just need to put our faith in the Redeemer of our soul. We have to accept it. And when we do that, the work's finished. And the sin debt that was owed on our account is paid in full. And it's paid once and for all. When you think about what a kinsman redeemer is, it's all about what was lost being found. You and I were lost and on the verge of losing everything. But Jesus stepped in. He restored what was lost. He gave us a new identity in Christ. As Ruth became Boaz's wife, so we become betrothed to our kinsman redeemer. So even the bridal language is in there as well. I could have got that said to Mike. I could have done about 4 weeks on this one. But the beautiful thing is we never have to worry about having to be redeemed again. It's what Mike was saying this morning. It's done. He paid the price of redemption once and for all. You see, we as human beings long for redemption, just as Naomi's family left the promised land and nearly lost everything. The human race left Eden, as we said, and lost many of the blessings that wanted to give us. We've each experienced this. We know, each of us in this room know about brokenness and loss, that life didn't turn out as we would want it to be, or as God would have liked it to be had we not lived in that place of sin. But God is gracious, and he will sustain and bless us anyway, even when we aren't living in our promised land. You see, still we crave a deeper, fuller restoration. We know there's still more. It's been paid, but we're not living in the fullness of it all. We need to be willing to recognise that person who buys us back. We need to live in the fullness of knowing we've been bought back. We personally, as Ruth, you see, this is why he acquired Ruth. We have to understand it's not about, it's actually about we become his possession when we accept him as our kinsman redeemer. As Ruth became his possession as a wife, and we hate that idea. But actually, do we want to be, he says we're his, what's that word, Mike, about our possession, about us being his possession?
Secular.
Secular, which means
Treasured possession.
his treasured possession. It's not a possession for him to abuse. It's a possession for him to delight in. A treasured possession. He's secular. We become his possession. We need that Redeemer. Because that's what Jesus does for us. He buys back what we lost. And even though many of us in this room have things in our lives that we lost, that we wouldn't have wanted to lose, what Jesus gives us back is so much better. So much better. And though Ruth lost her husband back in Moab, and Naomi lost her husband, what they found when they came into this relationship with their kinsman redeemer was so much more. Jesus restores our life in full. Now, the other interesting aspect of this story is that Jesus actually ends up being a descendant of Ruth. Because Boaz doesn't only just point to Christ as our kinsman redeemer, but Christ is actually descended from Boaz and Ruth to show us how important that story is. We read at the very end of the book of Ruth, we read this last verse. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. And Jesus is of the line of David. So this beautiful story actually establishes the family from which Jesus, from Bethlehem, this is that descendant, that he comes from. He's a direct descendant of so he's a direct descendant through the genealogy. The promised Messiah, the Saviour of the world, is a descendant from this unlikely union between, and this is what we need to remember, Ruth was a Gentile, but Boaz redeemed her into her Jewish heritage. I mean, this story goes on and on.
That's why you come to save the Jews and the Gentiles.
Well, the point is we're grafted in.
Yes, right.
And Ruth was grafted in.
Yeah.
And then brought forth a child that brought forth the line of David. The beauty of what God actually wants through Jesus coming as kinsman redeemer is massive. These two people brought together by God's sovereign hand in order to accomplish his divine plan. And God foreknew this plan involving Ruth and Boaz before the creation of the world, and he brought it to a climax in the fullness of time with the coming of Christ as the true kinsman redeemer. What we see again is everything through this whole testament is God putting in place all the pictures, all the shadows, all the pictures of what he's about. And that's why, the disciples got it. They got it. They saw. Jesus didn't have to explain that he was going to be a kinsman redeemer. In the whole of what took place, they could see who he was. And that's why they were able then to go on and teach in the way they did. Without the Old Testament understanding, we do not see the fullness of what has been done for us. We just see God's sovereign hand guiding all these events, from Naomi and Ruth's tough times and loss to Boaz's redemption of Ruth. We can see God at work. So ultimately, the book of Ruth points to Christ and his gospel as it reveals to us a God who works all things for the good of those who love him. Because Ruth loved her mother-in-law so well, she was set in a place to be able to be used in this way by God. But there's another aspect to this. It's not just about our personal redemption. Remember, he brought back not just Ruth and Naomi and gave them a good life. He brought back the land. You see, not only has Jesus come as the kinsman redeemer to redeem us, but he's also going to redeem the land, as Boaz did for Naomi and Ruth. Just as God provided a way through a redeemer to buy back the land that has been lost, so he's provided a redeemer to pay the price to purchase all things back to God once more. Eden wasn't just about Adam and Eve. Eden was about a place, a perfect place, a place that functioned exactly as God had created it to.
Yeah.
That price was paid on the cross for all humanity to be redeemed if they would believe and accept. But that price was also paid to redeem all of creation and undo the consequences of the curse that was placed upon it. And that involves the ground, the plants and trees, the animal kingdom, as well as humanity.
Yeah.
It shall all be redeemed and returned to God. That was the intention of a kinsman redeemer, that it would all be returned back. So Isaiah 59 tells us this. This is what it says about, we know now, Jesus. He puts on righteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head. He put on garments of vengeance for clothing and wrapped himself in zeal as a cloak. According to their deeds, so will he repay. Wrath to his adversaries, repayment to his enemies. To the coastlands he will render repayment. Do you remember another aspect of the kinsman redeemer was that he would get revenge. Yeah, he would revenge.
Yeah.
In part of the redemption, he would revenge those who had come against. So they shall fear the name of the Lord from the west, and his glory from the rising of the sun. For he will come like a rushing stream which the wind of the Lord drives, and a Redeemer will come to Zion, to those in Jacob who turn from transgression, declares the Lord. Now, this prophecy we need to understand. Because we need to understand that wherever we see vengeance in a passage, which we do in this one, we know it's talking about the time when Jesus comes again, not his first coming. All right? We are living in the year of favour. There is a day of vengeance to come. Vengeance is not yet here. Vengeance comes when he returns. So if this passage just said he put on righteousness like a breastplate and a helmet of salvation, it could be talking about Jesus' first coming. But when you see him slip on the clothing prepared for the last days, the garment of vengeance, then we know we're talking about a second coming passage. And this passage shows Jesus preparing to take back his possession from his enemies. He's already, as kinsman redeemer, bought back us, people. But there is a Redeemer coming to Zion with wrath and recompense for his enemies. And so this Redeemer hasn't just paid the price, but he is willing to do that last part of the redemption. He is willing to come with power and take possession of what was redeemed. Jesus Christ is willing and able to pay the price. And he did do that. He paid the price 2,000 years ago. And this scripture in Isaiah shows us that he has the power to take possession of that which he redeemed, even if it means taking it by force. And that day is coming. And that day includes not only people, but this entire earth. He will come and take possession of it again. He will redeem not just people, but the whole earth. And only then, as Revelation tells us, will the kingdoms of this world become the kingdom of our God, and will our kinsman redeemer have brought back everything that was lost back in Eden. As always, with nearly all of these pictures that we're seeing, all these foreshadowings that we see in the Old Testament, they speak of what God, Jesus has done and of what he will do. And there is what he has done and what he will do in the whole identity of kinsman redeemer that he fulfills. So many of us have areas of our lives where we've experienced loss and brokenness, and that story of Naomi and Ruth should encourage us that God's plan is to restore us to life in its fullness. It should renew our hope. If at any point we begin to think, oh, I've lost all this, I wish I hadn't lost that, we have to come back to this story and know, no, he has redeemed me, and everything that is in him and everything that is yet to come is far greater, far better than what he has allowed me to lose. And even the world is a dark place, and it is a dark place at the moment, we have a kinsman redeemer who will restore all things. And I'm sure our brothers and sisters in Russia and Ukraine are standing on these promises at the moment. The story of Ruth actually takes place during the times of the judges. And we saw last week that was a time of darkness in Israel's history, as they went round in circle after circle after circle. And yet in the midst of that, God makes sure that we get this little story of Ruth and Boaz to show us that even in the time when he was having to deal harshly with his people because they kept going round in circles, there is still this glorious redemption possible, even in the midst of it all, through Jesus. We can know that redemption now as we put our faith in Jesus, our kinsman redeemer. And we can look forward to the complete redemption of all creation when he returns. He is our kinsman redeemer. We are his redeemed, and he will redeem all things. It's a beautiful story, but it has so much more in it than just a story. Praise God.